Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Data Architecture Virtual Group for October 24th, 2018. Today, we are glad to have Mark Wiel and Sreevani from HVR Software back to talk to us again. They're going to be talking about to the cloud and back data processing in the cloud for on-premises analytics. Our only remaining upcoming session for the 2018 year is in December. We've got Tim Mitchell talking about temporal tables. We're going to get some more scheduled into 2018, or into 2019 rather. So keep an eye out on your email or on our website to see more things as they get scheduled. We'd like to thank HVR Software for being a sponsor of the virtual group. They've just renewed for another year. We're very, very happy to have them. I feel like I lost this slide here. There it goes. And we're also thankful to have Nutanix as our second sponsor of the virtual group. Be sure to check both of them out and thank them for sponsoring us. Past Marathon coming up. The recordings are available. It's not coming up. So if you missed any of the sessions from there, or you'd like to see some again, you can go to the past website and see those recordings. Some upcoming virtual group webinars. The next one coming up is the cloud group tomorrow, and then here's some more going farther into November. And then upcoming SQL Saturdays. SQL Saturdays very important to me. So some coming up this weekend. You've got Lincoln and Munich. And then Past Summit coming up the first week in November. It's a really great time, probably the best place to be if you work with SQL Server. Rob and I are both going to be there. So if you spot us, come by and say hello. And if you haven't registered for Summit yet, we'd really appreciate it if you use our discount code right there. Register, and you can save $150 off the cost of your registration. And with that, I have nothing else to read off my deck, so I'm going to hand off to Sreevani from HVR, and I'll be here if you guys need any help.
Very well. Thank you very much, Kenny, for the introductions. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure for me and my colleague Mark to be able to spend an hour with this wonderful audience from around the world. Like Kenny said, I am Sreevani Abbaraju. I'm the Director of Product Management here at HVR Software. I am joined by my colleague and our Chief Technology Officer here at HVR, Mark Wiel. Between the two of us, we will be your presentation hosts for today, and we look forward to having an exciting and an interactive session. All right, just to kick things off, I'd like to draw a little timeline from my own professional experience. And over the past 15 plus years, I've had roles that were on the consumer side and the vendor side of the data world, if you will. As a data consumer, I actually painstakingly still recall asking someone else to provide me the monthly sales data, pipeline data, quarterly performance data, etc. At the time, I'm talking 15 years ago, we used to place service requests into IT teams who shielded and guarded access to data with their life. But that process has, bottlenecks, like we all know, when you service an enterprise on such level of requests. I believe at the time the tools that we were using were also something like SSRS, Brio, Access, Perl, etc., just to cobble together data to create a single data set for just a single report. Obviously, things have evolved since then, and the data landscape just shifted from business being a consumer to business being a driver of data. And also, the user started demanding democratization of data. It's not anymore an IT monopoly over data, but it's, get it out in the hands of the business analysts and data analysts who can actually make that impact. Well, just to support that evolution, we in the industry have also seen a proliferation, if you will, of tools to support like self-service reporting, self-service data preparation, self-service BI, and so on and so forth. if you think about even analytics from that point of view, predictive and prescriptive analytics, they've come out of the hands of top expertise like a data scientist and come to a more common data analyst. Citizen data analyst, I think, is a term that's been floating around over the last 5 to 7 years. Today, BI and analytics tools, they serve as a less technical user. They're designed to be used by less technical users. But what does that mean? It means that there's more and more reason to use data by the end users to make decisions that positively impact your business. But think of this. How are organizations getting to consume analysis ready data sets? Who is coming up with these massive data sets? Who is setting up governance around it? How are they making sure the data integrity is intact, etc.? It's your data teams. They're working hard in the back end. And the evolution of analytics and business intelligence, this has only been possible because of the rapid evolution in the data integration technologies. And that brings us to HVR. And we at HVR are proud to say that for the last 16 plus years, we've been at the forefront of this evolving data integration market to solve complex, large scale, heterogeneous data integration challenges. We currently have over 200 organizations actively utilizing HVR for their data needs. Our distributed architecture, scalability, high performance, and comprehensive change data capture based replication technology is how we're able to do this. And as I said, it's our pleasure to be here with this audience as the host and sponsor of the event. So we're talking about evolution of the analytics space supported by the revolution in data integration technologies. But just think about your DBA. This DBA is provisioning for your entire enterprise analytics ready data. What are they struggling with? They're grappling with massive amounts of data that's spread out over on-premise, in the cloud, in data lakes, in files, in a small server sitting under somebody's desk, or perhaps in a secret back office only a secret handshake will get into. Well, of course, I'm kidding there. When you have such a broad variety of data sources, you introduce the cliche 3 V's of data: volume, velocity, and variety, driving initiatives like data lakes over the past 5 years that became quite popular. But again, ladies and gentlemen, the data and database industry is evolving at such a rapid pace and innovating at a rate that we never saw before. I was actually reading up an article recently, and it calls out a fact that we're seeing on a day-to-day basis within our customer base. I think the statement went something like this: that over the last year and a half, the center of gravity of data revolution shifted away from data lakes to databases in the cloud. Now, how does this new trend impact the data consumers? Well, here to talk about this trend and the thought process organizations are going through in the adoption of cloud in the context of analytics is my esteemed colleague and CTO of HVR Software, Mark. Mark, why do you think we see this shift? There's a clear drive towards cloud adoption, especially in the data integration for analytics. How do you see this?
Well, that's a great question, Sreevani. And from that perspective, and hello, everybody, since this is the first time you hear my voice, this is a good segue into the presentation, because we're going to talk about cloud adoption. But what I'll, given your question about it, so how come we see organizations adopting the cloud? I think part of what we're seeing here is, and we see that across our customer base as well, is organizations have invested significant amounts of money in on-prem infrastructures, and some of those investments, they run in certain life cycles. And I think from the perspective of now databases in the cloud and cloud adoption, I think what we're seeing is that there is a kind of an end of an investment cycle like that, which opens up the opportunity for the organizations to reconsider their investment strategy as it reflects to hardware investments and running on-prem versus using cloud alternatives. And I think over the past several years, the cloud has become a more attractive destination. And I think part of what we're seeing right now is simply that we're reaching an end of an investment cycle, and organizations are actively reconsidering where they go next. And I think we see a lot of organizations, also driven by the software manufacturers, being almost forced to pick their battles, right, or pick their vendor that they want to move forward with. Of course, a lot of the audience here will be looking at an Azure, and we'll be showing Azure in today's demo, but you'll also see some of the other vendors, specifically in the database world, in the application worlds, pushing their platforms. You'll see SAP pushing the SAP cloud. You'll see Oracle pushing the Oracle cloud. Of course, Amazon, the elephant in the room, would be pushing the Amazon cloud, etc. And I think, again, going back to, well, the cloud, why is it more attractive today? I think that's actually a great topic, and we'll go through some of that in more detail throughout this presentation. So with that, I was going to shift to the agenda here. So we'll talk a little bit about cloud adoption and some of the motivations why organizations start using the cloud. But then let's talk about a hybrid approach, right? We'll first pull up a definition of what we mean by a hybrid approach, and then explain like how we're facing and dealing with the hybrid approach and some of the challenges and considerations that come to mind, along with a few examples when we're taking a hybrid approach. And then we'll do a quick demo of the HUR technology. As Sreevani alluded to, we're focused on the real-time data integration, and we're often involved in cloud scenarios. In fact, now I would say at least 9 out of 10 use cases that we come across have a cloud angle, whether it's source, destination, or both. We'll see them. We see them a lot, so we want to quickly show the technology. So, given the audience is pretty technical generally on this call, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, please do put in your questions as we go along into the Q&A panel on your GoToWebinar, and then we'll certainly try to get to them at the end of the presentation. And if not, we'll follow up by email afterward. So why do organizations start using the cloud, right? So and we hear a lot of this across our customer base and prospects we speak to, and when we go to trade shows like SQL Pass, we'll be at SQL Pass as well at the beginning of November. What we hear is organizations saying, well, it's actually quite budget friendly, right? Cloud is more of a pay-as-you-go versus a large capital investment up front that finance needs to write off over time, and it's all challenging. It's more budget friendly. You turn it on when you need it. You can turn it off when you don't need it, which also speaks to that second point. It's elastic, right? I have more flexibility in the amount of resources that I need. I have the ability to allocate more resources as needed, and I can shrink again. And some organizations, they have very much seasonal requirements. Well, the elasticity there helps. Where in an on-prem environment, you might have to scale up to the biggest environment you might need throughout the year. In the cloud, there's some elasticity to take advantage of. External data sharing is much more easily facilitated by a cloud environment. When you're using the Azure cloud, you can define the firewall rules yourself, so you can indicate access levels, you can set the security, etc., which is much easier than working with the network administrators in the organization. Of course, everybody very conscious of access to servers from the internet coming in. In fact, people don't, or network administrators generally don't like that. They'd like to keep the firewall shut for pretty much everything. So utilizing some cloud can facilitate some of that external data sharing, and the cloud vendors have done a pretty good job of enabling that and making that flexible and accessible for more general users. Cloud allows for innovation, right? We see in the Azure environment, we see, of course, Microsoft delivering lots of new services over time and coming up with all these new technologies that become available. And with a budget-friendly, pay-as-you-go, elastic, scalable environment, it allows us to try out some of these technologies quite easily and then turn them off if we don't need them. And then, of course, beyond Microsoft, there is also the marketplace that provides some other sources of innovation, technologies, services that we can easily start taking advantage of in the cloud, because all the provisioning, everything happens there. It makes it much quicker, much easier. Think back a few years, right? If you'd have to go get an approval to purchase a license for some kind of software just because you wanted to try it, it's much more complicated than if you can just turn it on and off in the cloud as needed. And then lastly, global access is similar to external data sharing. It's much easier to deploy your data in different availability zones and essentially different data centers, make your systems more available, more globally accessible, and have an environment that is arguably better geared for uptime than on-premises environments. So these are some good motivations why organizations look at the cloud. However, there's some concerns as well. One concern is cost, and of course this kind of contradicts the budget-friendly aspect, but we do see organizations, and we actually face this ourselves as well. It's quite easy to enable things in the cloud and start ranking up some of the costs. It's not necessarily always equally visible what the cost is and what is still used, what is no longer used. And of course, the cloud vendors are not strongly motivated to inform you of unused resources. So that's one item to consider. Security, even though the cloud vendors have made massive progress over the last several years in the security area, it's still an ongoing concern for some organizations, and certainly from the perspective of your data, essentially the most important, arguably some of the most important asset of your organization is becoming the data. It's very important, and you need to be very aware of the security implications of starting to use the cloud. And then, of course, certain organizations will face regulatory restrictions on using the cloud or on storing data in different availability zones across the world. There's the vendor viability and reliability aspect of utilizing the cloud. Of course, with Microsoft and the Azure cloud, we have relatively low risk there, but generally that is still being concerned. And there is, of course, then in addition to that, the concern of the vendor lock-in, right? Like, of course, it may sound attractive today, but what happens if you're locked in? And I think with some of the enterprise vendors, we have seen over time that the lock-in can get pretty expensive over time. And then lastly, some of the data integration challenges, right? So we start storing data into the cloud. What does that mean from an integration perspective? Where does some of the data go to? Where does it come from? How can we ensure that from a data integration perspective, we can manage the cloud environment?
So, Mark, this is Sreevani again. I'm interested some more on your thoughts around the data integration challenges, because, with HVR being a data integration solution provider, we talk to customers on a daily basis. And one thing we clearly see is, there's so many legacy applications and their corresponding databases that are still on-premise, right? So from that standpoint, we have customers who are thinking cloud first, which means, every new application from now and going forward will be in the cloud. Versus a brownfield approach, where they're saying there are some applications that are low risk for us. They will be migrated to the cloud. So with different considerations between greenfield and brownfield approach, how do you see either a pure cloud or a pure on-prem strategy either be successful, some pros and cons? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question, Sreevani, and thanks for bringing that up, because I think for large organizations, it's more likely than not that there's going to be a hybrid approach, right? In fact, we talk about hybrid cloud, and I'm just pulling up this definition whilst I continue to address your question. I think for organizations, for some of the larger organizations in the world, but also mid-sized organizations who genuinely run 24/7, I think a lift and shift into the cloud is almost impossible. And you'll get into a situation where, sure, we could do cloud first, and we actually see a lot of that when we see organizations adopt data lakes and analytical systems, in that nowadays it's almost all of that is going into the cloud and is using the Azure Data Warehouse, is using the Azure Data Lake Store, and technologies similar to that, where the cloud is indeed considered first, but there is, like you said, a massive amount of systems that still rely on on-premises data sources that have integration set up with other technologies, with other applications on premises or even in the cloud. And organizations are strongly motivated now to move these gradually to the cloud. And I think that's where we see the most successful organizations take this relatively slowly and step by step. That's where we see some good successes, where organizations plan for a migration to the cloud. They gradually start moving their data there. And then, of course, when we're involved, we see them keeping the data in sync for a while between on-prem and the cloud, and then eventually they start shifting some of those application workloads to the cloud and gradually start considering turning off the on-premises environments. But none of this is easy, and it can take a while to get there. So with all of that said, when we talk about hybrid cloud, so hybrid cloud, we use that term to indicate the coexistence of on-premises and cloud servers and services, as well as the use of multiple different cloud providers. And I think that's important to realize, that it's not only between on-prem and cloud, it's also different cloud providers. And if you think about, well, how do you work in your organization? It's more likely than not that you're using multiple cloud providers, right? Maybe if you're in a sales role, you probably use some CRM solution, and maybe that's Microsoft Dynamics, or maybe that's a Salesforce or a NetSuite or something like that. That's a cloud application. But that doesn't mean that you don't run SQL Server in Azure as well. Of course, Dynamics is one thing. If you're using Salesforce, you're using two different cloud providers, and maybe you're motivated to integrate data between these. Now, if we look at what the industry thinks about using multi-cloud or hybrid approaches, so essentially if we go back to HCR's prior definition, the hybrid cloud, Gartner thinks that by 2020, 75% of all organizations will be running in a multi or hybrid cloud model. So that means there's going to be lots of integration work, and I think those are certainly exciting days for us at HCR, but probably for most of the audience as well. So with all of that said, let's talk a little bit about, well, why do organizations use a hybrid approach, right? So one consideration is that commonly comes up is using the cloud as a backup. So we have on-prem resources. We utilize those. Sometimes we don't have enough resources. Well, then we can utilize the cloud for some additional resources. Or we run on-prem, and if something bad would happen to the on-prem environment, maybe it's unavailable, well, then we shift to the cloud in order to pick up from there. So using the cloud as a backup resource is a common reason for using a hybrid approach. Of course, there's the hardware investment angle. It's the peaks and the troughs as we go through the seasons, where organizations may have already invested in on-premises hardware, but maybe also they want to start utilizing more of the cloud to be less dependent on on-prem investments. There's security and regulated reasons why we might use hybrid approaches. Maybe some of the data can easily be moved into the cloud, but other data needs to remain on premises. And then there's some considerations around latency reduction in that depending on where the data lives, there may be a relatively high latency involved in getting to the data or getting to the right data. And from that perspective, a hybrid approach could be used as a means to reduce that latency.
I actually have a thought on the latency reduction. It's a topic that's always gets DBAs and business users interested at the same time, right? If you think about it, or industries like financial services, for example, large banks, multinational banks, and small credit unions. If you look out right now, they're using real-time insights about using the information they have about a customer's um, previous known behavior to predicting what their future behavior is going to look like. And a good example is an ad I just saw recently that talks about, do if your credit information is compromised? And do you want to be notified instantly? That's the positioning financial services is taking now, and they're investing millions of dollars in making that their competitive edge. So what they're really doing is using data and real-time insights as a competitive differentiator today. Now, what they're providing insights on are different, but basically they're using data and insights based on their data as a service to their own customers. So in that context, and you talked at length about, hybrid approach. With data spread out and databases spread out on premise and in the cloud, public or private cloud, multi-cloud, can you speak of how latency would be impacted in these various configurations and how hybrid approach somewhat mitigates such a latency situation? And I ask this question because no matter which audience you sit in front of, latency is a hot topic, either for technical users or non-technical users.
Sure, absolutely. And of course, Sreevani, latency or high latency has a different number attached to it to different audiences, right? If we think about trading applications, for trading applications, it's arguably milliseconds that count, whereas for some other interactions that we have, maybe it's fine if latency is up to a few minutes. But if you think about the fraud example that you highlighted, well, then arguably latency can be low enough to be successful from the perspective of identifying fraud, right? You want to know it as soon as it happens. You want to be able to flag an issue. Now, when we talk about latency reduction and we talk about hybrid cloud, more and more data sources these days are some cloud-related data sources, right? And if you think about the fraud example, well, maybe organizations start using Facebook feeds or some feeds from cell phone providers that can indicate where in the country, where on earth you are, that can help them identify when there's fraud, right? And if you used your credit card, or if somehow the organization decides that you're in New York, yet your ATM card is currently being accessed in San Francisco, well, then the odds are that is potential fraud, right? And that can immediately be flagged. And with those additional sources, and like we said, from a security and regulatory reason or perspective, we might not be able to store all the data in the cloud. Maybe we have some of our customer information and social security and all of that kind of data still residing on premises. We want to be able to relate that to data that's in the cloud. And that's where I think that's an example where latency reduction comes in, where we want to make sure that we can combine these data sets with adequate performance to be able to flag those potential fraud cases in this particular example. But I think across businesses, across organizations, you will find examples where latency reduction makes sense. And we have some of these examples also in the loan processing arena as well, where some of our customers utilize a hybrid approach specifically to reduce the latency and to be able to serve their customers better. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. So drilling a little bit more into detail, right? Cloud as a backup. Seasonality, of course, I've already mentioned. We talk about unpredictable growth, right? If you're a startup, using the cloud is very attractive. In fact, it's probably been very attractive for the last 10 years or so. When we're dealing with fluctuating demand, cloud can be very attractive. And then, like I mentioned, emergency hosting for business continuity. We actually have an example. This is one of our customers in the energy business. They're actually using the Azure cloud as a backup. They do some heavy lifting, some pretty heavy processing, and in order to do that, what they do is on their on-prem environment, they capture the data, push it into SQL Server in Azure, perform some of the heavy processing, and then the end result of that goes back to the on-prem system in order to do some further downstream processing. So that's a good example of an organization that starts utilizing the cloud essentially as an overflow, as an environment where they can have additional processing capacity available almost on an as-needed basis. Speaking of hardware investments, right? There's investments in on-prem technologies that may have been made and that continue to want to be leveraged. But then there is the cloud that can augment the investment, or the cloud that can be, in some cases, even a backup for that investment as well. And if we think about an example here from a car insurance perspective, right? So car insurance companies use, of course, a lot of information about incidents that happen, and more data sources get added to as data sources for car insurance companies, right? And they may get large volumes of data coming from particular data sources that, whilst they could be stored in an on-premises environment, it might be unattractive just because of the sheer volume of it, because of the sheer cost of storing all that information. Using the cloud in that example can be very attractive, combining that data or analyses against that data, and then mapping this or combining this with some of the on-premises data information from the insured parties is a very attractive and a very applicable example where hardware investment can be enhanced by some of the cloud resources. And then we're looking at security and regulatory reasons. Of course, like we mentioned before, sometimes organizations can't necessarily store some of their data in the cloud. So we have vulnerable data that cannot be exposed, data that maybe cannot be stored in a data center in a particular region. But then, of course, the flip side is that the cloud processing can enable some innovation. So from that perspective, we want to take the best of both worlds. We know we can't expose all of the data, but we do want to take advantage of some of that innovation that cloud processing enables us. And here is an example. Some of our other customers are in the defense industry, and they face exactly this problem. They've got security and regulatory restrictions that prevent them from using certain cloud systems, and some of the data simply cannot go into the cloud. And whilst they use alternatives like an on-prem equivalent of a cloud, in the end, we're talking about on-premises environments. However, of course, some of this defense equipment spits out lots of very interesting sensor-generated data, and maybe they want to utilize some of the artificial intelligence algorithms that are readily available in the cloud in order to analyze some of that data and find some needles in the haystack of that sensor-generated data. So from that perspective, there may be a strong motivation to at least store some of that data, maybe anonymized or whatever it takes, in the cloud, take advantage of the innovations the cloud can bring, but then at the same time still continue to store the data that simply cannot be stored in the cloud on-premises systems. And then lastly, we talk about latency reduction. Customer service can be compromised. Of course, we want to service our customers, and we know that customers will very easily change if they think if they're not treated well. So customer service is highly critical these days. And then from an end user perspective, from the employees' organizations, you want to make sure that they continue to be productive, that they can continue to do their work. Like I said, we have an example. One of our customers is an online loan processor. They use several cloud systems. And what they want to do is, or what they need to do is, in order to process the loans, they need to combine some of that data. And with some of the concerns about storing this data on cloud systems, what they ended up doing is pulling data from various secured cloud resources into an on-premises environment, and then run some of their routines, some of the calculations that they need to do in order to perform the online processes, in order to process the online loan applications. They run those on site, and with that, they achieve great customer service and utilize or use the best of both worlds from an on-prem and a cloud perspective. Now then, if we look at common challenges and how we can help address some of these challenges. Common challenges, of course, with hybrid cloud. We talk about performance, right? Of course, latency and performance are closely related, as there's a volume aspect to it. But performance is important when we start moving data between systems, between data centers, across wide area networks. We talk about security, very common challenge. And then, of course, we talk about data accuracy. So drilling a little bit into the details, and this talks more about the technology that we provide, is from a performance perspective, we promote a distributed architecture, and we do this particularly when there's wide area networks involved. We would like to see an agent, an installation of our software running on either end, at least, of the firewall or of the wide area network, so that we can utilize our efficient and secure communication along the way. We utilize compression for all of the data. We use large data blocks, and we can use SSL encryption for the data as it moves across the wire. Distributed architecture also allows for a high volume approach when there's multiple or many source systems and or many destination environments involved, and it makes it also very flexible if we consider the cloud to utilize multiple technologies in the cloud as well. And from that perspective, the technology then provides end-to-end capabilities to set up continuous data integration, real-time integration. It starts with discovering table definitions on source systems and creating compatible definitions on destination environments, running the initial load, which is then integrated with ongoing log-based change data capture and continuous integration. And then also there's a compare function there that helps you validate the data as it's moving through the pipeline. And then on top of that, of course, there's a graphical user interface, and there's abilities to monitor and manage the environment. From a security perspective, there's of course the data encryption angle. And again, if we utilize our agents, we have HVR executables on either side of a wide area network, then at least we don't have to worry about the encryption across the wire. All the authentication is then normalized, and we can utilize our SSL keys for authentication as well. But then also, there's always a consideration of using the firewall, right? Or opening up the firewall. When we start using cloud resources, of course, there is a potential need that the cloud may need to reach out into the on-premises data center. And I'm happy to say that most of our customers avoid that by running the central control environment, which we refer to as the HR hub, which here is right to the left of the firewall. They run it on premises because the hub is always the one that's going to be initiating the communication. And once the communication is initiated, then the reverse communication across the same communication channel is in fact allowed. So from that perspective, utilizing a hub on premises only forces you to open up the firewall into the cloud, and then we can start moving data across the wire. Now, in some environments, we do the reverse, and we do need to reach out into an on-premises data center. But for those environments, we can even use a proxy. For example, in a demilitarized zone, a DMZ environment, where the proxy will route or block traffic to on-premises systems and agents that run on on-premises systems. So this architectural diagram shows a good example of how organizations can manage a secure and a secure hybrid cloud environment. And then lastly, from a data accuracy perspective, before we quickly look at the demo, data validation environments, those of course are important because they prevent major errors. They give you some insight into potential data issues along the way, whatever the reason is why they got introduced. They give you some higher confidence in the data that's moving, and they allow you to easily identify and correct errors, right? As much as we have the data validation, the compare function, we also have a repair function that can help correct any errors.
Hey, Mark, it's Sreevani again. This is not a question, but I just wanted to reinforce how important data accuracy is. And I'd like to bring that up in the context of a recent conversation we had with a major retail giant. So in the context of data integration, and especially when you're talking about so many data silos coming together into a massive data set that's consumable into a reporting application or an analytics application, the ability to validate that the data that you have is accurate is key to the success of this data platform, right? But if you come to think of it, business users demanded data, democratization of data, but all they asked for is give us data that's accurate, that they can have confidence in the veracity of the data. Because data is going to be so distributed in the hands of these end users, it poses a whole new challenge around governance, around access control. And like I said, most importantly, the truth and the accuracy and validity of the data. So to the audience, I mean, in that example I used for financial services, if such a business that uses real-time insights as a competitive differentiator, as a key to business growth, those insights better be accurate. Those insights better be valid, which means, the data that supports them need to be accurate, which also means, in your words, Mark, confidence in how you integrated data from all those data sources, either on-premise, in the cloud, multi-cloud, hybrid, or whatsoever.
Yep, I fully agree. So with that, let's take a quick look at the demo that we prepared for today. So in this demo, we mimic an on-premises environment on the left-hand side where the HR control environment is running. There's a SQL Server running there, and then we have a repository that in this case is local to the environment. It all runs on my laptop that's sitting here on my desk. And then we're integrating we're essentially augmenting the resources that we have in the on-prem environment by utilizing some cloud resources where we go connect to an agent on a virtual machine, connect into a SQL Server database running in Azure, and then have it essentially perform a computation based on a stored procedure that we created in SQL Server, and then push the result back into the on-prem environment where we've set up a BI database that would be used for analytics. Now, of course, this is all in a mimicked environment, but let's take a look across this environment. And where I'd like to start is right here, because we just introduced our latest version. It was quite literally yesterday. This is the 5.5 version of our technology, and one of the new features, or one of the new capabilities, is this insight capability. So what this shows us is basically how my integration has been performing, right? And we talked about the importance of latency. So I can see here how my latency has evolved over the last, few hours, right? I've been running a light workload on my system for the last few hours, and I see that the maximum latency went up to 2 seconds. So that's pretty good. Now, if I stretch this a little bit, I was playing with the environment earlier. Well, you see that I had some spikes there, right? So it's good to know and good to see that HR has this ability, this is built-in capability to store this information that keeps track of what was going on the system. And then if we need some more information, we have tons of extra information that we can take a look at here. Like maybe I want to know what was the transaction workload on the system. Maybe I can correlate some of the higher latency with some of the operations that are happening on my system. So I think this is a great dashboard that can help us troubleshoot over time. And again, whilst this there was an equivalent capability, it didn't in the prior version as well. It didn't look nearly as cool and slick as this. Plus, it didn't update continuously. So this is a great new capability. Now, if then I go back and look at the HR console, right? Like, how has this system been configured, and how has that configuration that I showed you on the slide, how has that been running, right? So this is the HR graphical user interface, and when it first comes up, it shows the start page where you can go and get some more information about certain technologies and setups. It is basically a guide for you where we've got pointers to videos and guides and documentation. But then from there, I basically connect to a hub. So in this case, I've created a SQL Server database on my local machine that is that I'm using for this webinar, right? And within that hub, what I've defined is a few locations. I've got my local database, which is a database called TPCC, and of course, I can connect to this database and I have it running there. I have my Azure environment, right, where we connect to HR using this Azure virtual machine. We log in there, and then we connect to a database that is called MVDemoDB on that machine. And then we have back to on-prem, we have our BI database that we're using as well. So, and then I have channel set up. So I'm running a very simple workload. It starts by taking all of 9 tables and pushing those into Azure. The way we define those setups is we use location groups to indicate what source and destination is, and those are then essentially linked to the physical endpoint by utilizing this dialog where we can check the box for one or more systems that are represented by this source or destination. And then we've imported table definitions out of the dictionary, and then we've defined using actions how the data is going to flow. So in this case, we capture the data from all of the tables, and we utilize these options. Now, in this case, I'm using all the default options. This is filtered for SQL Server because it's only in the context of SQL Server, and we have this online help function that helps us guide us through the various options. Now, again, I'm using all the defaults in a very straightforward setup. Likewise, on the destination side, we use an action, and by the way, actions get created using the context menu. I use an integrate action, and the only option that I use here is that I indicate using a specific session name that is no longer the default to indicate that on the capture side, on the way back, we don't actually lose track of this particular transaction. And then also what we do as part of this is, as part of the data flow, I've created a stored procedure that is calling update aggregates, which essentially computes some aggregates and then pulls the data across. So then my other channel, which is capturing from Azure and pushing information back into the BI database, it uses then those tables that I've created that essentially represent aggregate information. And similar to the other channel definition, I use a capture, I use an integrate, and then I use an option here, which works well for the kind of workload. My stored procedure isn't very efficient, so I'm using a burst option in order to make my environment a little bit more performant. So out of this, I've initialized those components. Out comes a runtime environment with capture jobs running, integration jobs that are running, and I can monitor the log in this console. Of course, we see in customer environments, we see lots of these jobs. We have customers who literally run with hundreds of sources in a single setup, so they have a nice overview of what is going on in the system, and then they can monitor what is going on in the system. And you see here, slowly, my system is already quite busy processing. It shows all that information. So, and then we mentioned the compare function, right? So I can go in at any point in time and I can validate if my data is in fact in sync. We take checksums here. We go between source and destination. This is always the most nerve-wracking part of the demo. I can validate if my data is in fact in sync. So even though the row count might be identical, that doesn't necessarily mean the checksum is the same. So those are some of the capabilities. One last thing that I'll show here is that if there's any, of course, we don't have to monitor this on an ongoing basis. We can scan the log for issues. We can set latency thresholds, and then if there's problems, we can receive emails when there's an error or a warning, or we can get information on Slack, or we can integrate with SNMP. So in a quick nutshell, that is a demonstration of how we can utilize some of this hybrid cloud and how we can utilize our technology in order to enable this. So just to summarize, we talked a little bit about the motivations for cloud adoption. We talked about why organizations use a hybrid approach. We talked about backups. We talked about augmenting investments. We talked about security and regulatory reasons, and then we talked about latency and reducing the latency. And then we talked about some of the challenges and considerations, and then I just walked you quickly through a demo of how we can utilize the HER technology to set up some cloud environment. And with that, I wanted to hand it back to Kenny to see if there's any questions from the audience that we can address at this point.
Mark, I do have a few questions here. The first one do you support a multi-cloud integration?
That's a great question, Kenny. And the answer is absolutely yes, we do. From our technology's perspective, we look at a system basically from the perspective of an IP address or a DNS entry. And whether that is in the cloud or in on-premises, it doesn't really matter to us, or whether it's in one cloud availability zone versus another, it doesn't really matter. It can be in different regions. It can be on different cloud platforms, right? We support some of the cloud applications like Salesforce, and data may be integrated into a system in Azure. So absolutely, we support multi-cloud environments.
The next one is, let's see. Do I have to open a firewall to my on-premises data center in order to use the technology, or is that only something that I need to do if the hub is not on premises?
Yeah, that's a great question, and yes, indeed, only if the hub does not live on premises, then there would be a requirement to open up the firewall into the on-prem environment. But the option is there to utilize a proxy for a setup like that. It's not unusual for organizations to have a DMZ as part of the on-premises data center, which is essentially an environment that is accessible from the internet in, of course, still behind a firewall. And through a proxy, you would only have to open up the firewall specifically to the proxy server, and then the proxy server is then becoming the gatekeeper as well as the router for downstream data transportation and essentially allowing or disallowing connections to go through. So it's still secure, but yes, if the hub does not reside on premises, then indeed the firewall will need to be opened.
Awesome. And then this is the last couple, unless another one comes in while I'm reading this. You said you'd like to see an agent on either end. Do I have to use an agent? And if so, what are the benefits of using an agent versus not using an agent?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and we commonly hear it. In fact, we commonly hear it in competitive situations as well, because the industry, I guess, doesn't necessarily always agree on the use of agents. The reason why we like to see it, and I explicitly mentioned on either end of a wide area network link, is because our communication is optimized for relatively low bandwidth and relatively high latency connections, and wide area networks, even though we now have, of course, far more bandwidth than we had a couple of decades ago, it's still relatively low bandwidth and still relatively high latency. So from that perspective, with communication optimized for those kinds of networks, the agents help a lot. We also we compress the data. We use large block transfer. So from that perspective, the use of agents is highly recommended. I mentioned it in the context of security, both from an authentication and an encryption perspective. The use of agents is recommended because then we don't necessarily have to worry about my remote database connection. Does it in fact encrypt or not? How efficient does it move the data? But then I also would like to highlight that I explicitly did not say that the agent should be running necessarily on the same machine where the transactional processing database runs, and because that's absolutely not a prerequisite or a requirement. For most of the technologies that we support both a direct access mode that we would use if we can, as well as a mode where we can perform log-based change data capture through an SQL interface. So whilst the agent should be sitting on either end of a wide area network connection, that doesn't mean it has to be sitting on the same machine where SQL Server runs. So I hope that addresses that question.
It did. Thank you very much. That's the last of the questions I have. So Mark and Sreevani, I want to thank you both again very much for joining us today. Thanks to everybody for attending the session. If that's exactly what I was going to ask. If you have any more questions, there's the contact information to get to HVR software, and we'll see everybody in December for our next meeting. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.